Yes, hello Bergen. Sorry I couldn't join. I was sick. I did try my best, but things happen. Um, and today I'm going to be talking about a company-wide postmortem that we did in Schibsted Media. I'll give you a bit of the context, the background, and how we approached it and what we learned from it. So a little bit about me, not that much, but I'm a tech enabler working in the CTO office of Schibsted Media. I've been in Schibsted around 8 years. Outside of work, I'm the board leader of Techno's Network for Developers, and I've been doing that for about 3 years, I think. Yes. So what is Schibsted? I think if you live in Norway, you probably know what Schibsted is. Even if you don't, then you have heard of our brands. We're a news company. We have VG, Bergens Tidende, Aftenposten, Aftonbladet in Sweden, SVD, E24, Stavanger Aftonbladet. So we have quite a few different newspapers, and we are very much a news company. We are not a tech company. We use tech in order to achieve the mission of journalism, but we are not a tech company. And these are some of the brands. These are the main ones that we'll be talking about today. We have several other brands and other products, but they're not the focus of this topic. We're talking about the core news brands that we have in Schibsted. And I'm sure if you're Norwegian or Swedish, you're familiar with at least one of these logos. So I'll start by saying something that I tell our developers when I talk to them. You aren't here to make designs. You're not here to write code. You're not here to manage backlogs. That's not why we employ you. We employ you to deliver news articles to users who love our sites. So product user first thinking. We don't hire people just to write code. Code is just a way to deliver news articles. But also we need to make sustainable revenue. The news industry is struggling. Social media, search engines, and now ChatGPT and AI-related things have eaten up our revenue in the past. So we need to approach things in a very cost-effective way. And because this talk is about a postmortem, it's important to include this little quote: "Those who cannot learn from the past are condemned to repeat it." We really valued looking at our history and figuring out where something went wrong and to try again the next time, having learned from the past. If we didn't learn from the past, we'd be doing the same thing over and over. So first, what are we going to be talking about today? So in Schibsted, we have several different papers, and we're going to be talking about one specific centralization attempt called CNP Web, Core News Product Web. And all it did was article rendering. So I'm just going to show you some parts of the article. So this is from Aftenposten. You see we have the head, the title at the top. We have a little description below. We have a picture with some caption. We have what we call the byline, where you can see the author. And if you've read news ever, you probably have seen this many times before, so it's not like a new thing to you. Then you have the article body, which is several paragraphs. Maybe you have some pictures and some subheaders, etc. And then finally at the bottom, you have links to other related articles or popular things. We call these widgets. So today, all we're going to be talking about is how we try to centralize this article rendering across our different brands and how we failed and what we learned from failing. So there's two important dates to keep in mind. So in 2016, that's when the birth of the centralization for article rendering kind of kicked off. And that was a long time ago now. But in 2023, we made the decision to shut that team down because we realized it was not working. In the middle there, you have some of our attempts at refactoring and delivering different packages to try and make it work a little better. But that timeline, 2016 to 2023, is 7 years. It took us a long time to act on the fact that it was not working. And here's a little graph of the complexity and the amount of cost and the time to deliver. So before we had CMP Web all the way on the left, I think you should be able to see my mouse, not sure. All the way on the left, then the stack complexity was relatively small and the time to deliver was very small because all the different news brands had their own stack. So they didn't need to care about Swedish newspapers. They didn't have to care about local regional newspapers. They only had to care about their own newspaper, which meant that it was very easy to deliver things. It was very easy to build things. But as a result of that, you had to have staffed up tech teams for every single newspaper that we had. So the cost was relatively high. Then during the actual core news product itself, this point here, we didn't intend to have the most complicated, most expensive and slowest time to deliver, but that's what ended up happening. And we were stuck in that position for a little while because instead of having just the individual brand teams being responsible for their own brand, you also had the central team. So we actually had duplication in a lot of places, even though we centralized things. And the central teams, they had to negotiate with all the different brand teams, which meant that the cost of development was relatively high because everything was so complicated. And the time to deliver went way down, or way up. Yeah. So it was very slow to build things, to try out new things. After CMB Web, we've started to come back down. So the stack is simpler, the cost of development is cheaper, the time to deliver. At the moment, it's kind of in a little bit of a still high phase, but probably in the future, I would say next year, we'll probably start to really reduce rapidly the time to deliver versus what we have today. So who am I and why was I given the task of figuring out why this went wrong? So me and my colleague Hilde, we had both been in Schibsted for a very long time. At that point, I'd been in Schibsted, I think 6 years, and she had been there too long for me to remember how long it is, but at least a decade, I think. And we also had been in several different teams, which was very handy because we needed perspectives from across the organization. And we also needed kind of the network effect of people being able to trust us because we wanted honest feedback on why this didn't work. We wanted to really hear from people and lift their voice up so that they could actually get their voice through to management. And there's no better way of doing that than having one of the people who have been heavily hands-on involved. So both me and Hilde have been in several teams. And this report and this initiative we called Vega 1.1, it was part of several that we did. And it can be summarized as the organization attempting to understand itself, to understand its history and figure out what has happened in the past. We tried to reflect the opinions, the thoughts and reflections of the entire organization. So it wasn't our opinions, it wasn't our thoughts or reflections, it was actually the organization. And to do that, we use quotes, both written form and also transcripts. So it's the employees' voices, not ours. And the process itself, we did a lot of interviews. We had a lot of workshops. We did about 10 group sessions, each of them about 2 to 3 hours, where we did a retro session, gathered the feedback, wrote up notes on the feedback that we received, figured out what went well, what didn't go well. We then interviewed people individually, including the CPO at the time, including the product director, including engineering managers, etc. So we spent a lot of time talking to people. And once we talked to people, we gathered a lot of written input and wrote a report that ended up being about a third of the length of the first Harry Potter book. And we really kind of wanted to make it so that the people who we interviewed would see what they had shared and said and felt like they were represented. We wanted to give a voice to them. And we focused on two different areas, technology and mandate. As it turns out, the reason why we ended up in this situation was not really technology related. It was more the mandate related. But we'll come back to that in a minute. And we also wrote the report in such a way that people could come to the different headings and they could go to a very specific topic and see in high detail what that topic was about, or the individual interviews. And we made executive summaries at the top, and we did a lot of slides. We presented this possibly 10 times, and we ran workshops after with teams when we have done a new reorg in order to help the teams understand how not to repeat the past. Yes, so here's just a little visualization of all the different teams. We had all the different brand teams that were users. We had the people that were actually building the platform, both in the final stages and the earliest stages. We had some other platform teams, and we had leaders involved. We also used a lot of tooling in order to make our lives easier because we spent a lot of time writing. So Retrium was a tool that we used for the retro. We just did the voting-based system and then took all that feedback and condensed it into a paragraph. We also used our in-house transcription tool based on Whisper, Yo-Yo, which helped us have direct quotes when people were willing for us to directly quote them. And I've blurred it out here a little bit, but you can see these are Post-it notes that we had in Miro. So we grouped them together by mandate tech, things that people praised about the team or direct feedback to the management. And we had a lot of Post-it notes. And the amount of deliverables that we had coming out of this is kind of insane when I think about it right now. Like, we had the Miro board, we had the report, we had all the different slide decks, we had all the workshops, we even had a AI podcast made from the report. Because it's no use writing this report if nobody's going to read it. Everyone in the organization needs to be aware of it. And we've taken it to all the leaders that we can. And they read it. And we know they've read it. Yes. And here's just the word count. You can see on the right the structure that we use. So we kind of group things together. We provided glossaries, some information on the methodology. We approached it relatively academic, I would say. So if you're used to academic research papers, it was pretty similar to that in terms of structure. Yes, so on to the findings, the juicy parts. And we, like I mentioned earlier, we kind of realized that the mandate was kind of a responsibility of why it didn't work out, because the mandate had a knock-on effect on the tech stack, and then had the effect for the teams that were using the tech stack. So to begin with, I mentioned earlier that we had those 7 or 8 papers that we were thinking about, the newspapers. Well, the initial idea was actually to sell our platform. So we weren't just worrying about 7 papers, we were worrying about thousands and thousands of global papers. Have you ever made a CMS that works with script, which is left to right and right to left? Or all the different languages that exist across the world, or all the different things that people care about in different countries. That was the initial idea, make something that we could sell. We were a very different company back then. And as a result, because it needed to be very flexible, it needed to be very scalable, to not just in terms of the number of readers or users that we have, but actually the kind of the types of newspapers that are using our tool. As a result, incredibly complex architecture. It was so complex that we had to go back to the start. And we lost a lot of time, actually, having to redo a lot of stuff that we've done in the past. And there's this little diagram of the Canadian framework where you have clear, complicated, complex, chaotic, and confused. Generally, if you want to be doing stuff in a simple way, then you want to be clear. You want to know what you're doing. Maybe you have to take a little side detour, but you know how to get from the start to the end. Whereas if you're in the chaotic end, you don't know what you're doing. You have unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. And as a result, you don't even know how to get from A to B. And that's kind of how it felt for people when they were building without really knowing what they were building, because they started out with one vision, the vision changed, but it wasn't particularly obvious to them. The second was that the misunderstood economy of scale, one size fits all. So like I mentioned, then if we have our 7 papers, and each one of those has their own unique identity, they have strong, very strong opinions on how news articles should look. Incredibly strong opinions. And when you multiply that by thousands, suddenly you don't get the economy of scale that was originally intended, because you now have to do a lot of configuration, you have to have a lot of custom CSS, you have to have a test rig in order to make sure that it all works, and the test rig ends up being so slow because everything is so complex. And our developers, they didn't want to write configs, they wanted to write code. Because writing code is something they are trained to do, they enjoy doing, they spend their weekends doing for fun. So writing configs in big YAML files isn't really what they wanted to do. And any change that they did make, there was a big fear of things breaking, even with the big test rig. So here's a classic example, bylines. Bylines are what we call the author and sometimes the time and date. So all our different newspapers have different opinions on what bylines should look like, the color, the font, the size. And actually none of our papers have the same byline, except for Bergens Tidende and Stavanger Aftonbladet, actually. But if we look at bylines a little bit, so you say, okay, first we have the author names. In the first case, we have 2 author names because they co-publish something. In the second, we just have 1. But the font is different. The one is bolded and one is not. So already they're slightly different. And then the way the images are handled is differently. So for example, there might be squared author images. There might be ones with backgrounds removed. So that's also a difference, but it's also a similarity. And then you have the date and time and the format that is pushed in. So for example, the VG style is that you write it in simple Norwegian when it's relatively short time, so 1 hour ago, for example. Whereas some of our other papers, they want to directly tell you when it was published and when it was last updated. And they don't want to turn that into like fancy words. They want that like clinically clean. So those are some differences on bylines. But in actuality, there's tens and tens and tens and hundreds of differences on different bylines. So what about external collaborations? How do we handle the emails of the authors? Do we have author pages? Do we hide the authors if the article is something that they might get death threats over, for example? What font should we use? Do we use their full name or just their first name? Etc. So bylines is not a simple thing when you think about it, even though at first it seems like, okay, they all should be the same thing, except the journalists and the newsrooms and the editor-in-chief, they care about the feel of their newspaper. They care about the feel of their articles. So for them, this is actually one of the biggest topics. The third finding, there was a lack of proper product management. So there wasn't really a full-time product manager assigned until relatively late. As a result, people were very confused. People weren't sure what they were doing. It kind of connected to the misunderstanding of the idea to sell or the economy of scale. If there'd been a consistent PM with a vision the whole way through, I think it probably would turn out a little bit better. But as a result, the designers and developers had to pick up the slack. So instead of having a product being driven by a PM, you had a product being driven by a developer or a designer. At some point, someone said, we're all tech leads. And if you know anything about leadership, if everyone is a leader, nobody is a leader. And as a result, when it came to the brand teams, the sort of the teams that were meant to use this platform, they had a very strong feeling of, this is not invented here. We don't like it. We don't need it. It doesn't do what we want it to do. We don't understand it. So everyone was left feeling like this was not invented here. We'll just do it our own way instead. And a good example of that, if you don't have a good priority and you want to make a game. So you have the idea, I want to make a game. I know what game I'm going to make. I want to make it. And then you go and you look around at game engines. You don't really try them out that much because that would take a lot of time. But your conclusion is, I don't like any game engines. And then you get distracted and you say, I'll make my own. And as a result, the game is never made. The framework is never finished. You never make the game engine, and you go back to the start a month later where you really want to make a game, but you end up making a game engine instead. It's the same for writing blogs or static site generators. It's human nature as developers for us to get the compulsion to kind of make an abstraction that we like, but that abstraction might distract from what we're actually trying to do. Whereas, for example, if you have the idea of making a game and you prioritize, I will use X game engine, then you are far more likely to at least have a prototype of a game engine. Not a game engine, game. You will not have a game engine. You will intentionally not have a game engine. And I think that's a little bit of what happened here is the abstractions became a problem. And if we'd kept it more specific with a clearer product vision, it probably would have worked out better. Finally, we had misaligned expectations and lack of buy-in incentives. So different teams had totally different expectations of what they wanted from the central platform. Some of them, they wanted a platform that would handle absolutely everything you see on an article page. So that would be the header, login, the widgets at the bottom that suggest articles, video, etc. Whereas other teams, they just wanted something where they could put article content and that was it. They would handle the rest. And at the same time, because there was no product management or effective product management at that point, then whoever the developers had been talking to last, their needs would get prioritized. And as a result, you ended up with this thing that had features that don't really complement each other, which led to a lot of options and variants being added to account for all the different needs that people had, which increased the complexity, which meant that the code itself was huge, gigantic, complicated, and it was not what the teams expected, even with those options and variants available. And it created this weird tension of the central teams versus the non-central teams, the brand teams. Consistently, all the feedback we got is that the people in those teams were great. Like, they were really good programmers, some of the smartest people that we had in the central teams. But at the same time, they did not like the product that they were given. So the brand teams, they did not like the central team's product. But it's not an individual thing, it's a product thing. And the product is not what they were expecting. So an example of where variety or options make things difficult. Imagine you have a function for buying tacos. So on the left-hand side, you can only make one type of taco. It's one with a white flour wrap. It has beef and avocado. It doesn't have anything else. You can't have anything else with it. That is very simple. That is very easy to maintain. It works. It probably would make some people unhappy, but maybe there's a percentage of people that would love this taco. Whereas on the right-hand side, if we have to account for the wrap, the contents, and the toppings, suddenly things start to get complicated. So maybe you have a taco that has a brown flour wrap and uses beans and beef and corn and cucumber and avocado, etc. Suddenly it gets incredibly complicated. And it gets harder to test, it gets harder to maintain, because what if you accidentally remove one of these if statements? Then what's going to happen? You're going to run into problems for some of the other users who are expecting there to be an option for buying corn wraps, for example. And if you think about that applied to the bylines example, what we ended up is something like the right-hand side, where the code for handling bylines alone, all the author options, the flavor text around it, the format of the date and time, the emails, etc., that ended up looking like the right-hand side, not the left-hand side. And if you apply that to every single thing that we have in an article, it suddenly gets very complicated. So those are the overall findings. And what did we learn from those findings? Well, one, we shouldn't have a shared tech without a shared product vision. If we had a consistent product vision the whole way through, then one, we could have known how to correctly correct our path when things were not working out. We would have been able to give feedback more consistently. We would have been able to say, no, we're not going to support that feature because it's not part of the product vision. Because we didn't have that, it ended up growing into a gigantic thing that people didn't like using and people didn't want to work on. You can't optimize for speed and flexibility. So the sheer amount of flexibility that it had meant that building things with it were incredibly slow. And I don't mean slow in terms of performance for the end users, but in terms of development time. One of our teams that we talked to, they said when they use this stack, they have to account for 3 times the length of any other task that they're given. So that task would take 3 times more than anything else they have. Avoid complexity. So sometimes abstraction is a good idea. Sometimes abstraction makes sense. When you have everything possible in your code base as an abstraction, suddenly it gets way too complicated. If you work with anything that has some form of generics, for example, or some kind of inheritance or some kind of fancy type system, and you've come across a type signature where you see that in order to understand that type signature, you need to first understand all the other type signatures in the code base, which might be in the thousands. That's a great example of where abstraction has gone a little too far, because now, in order to understand the abstraction, you need to understand the implementation, which is not really what abstraction is meant to do. And in a lot of cases, we, as programmers, we follow the do not repeat yourself mantra. But in some cases, you should. In some cases, the abstraction adds more complexity than it is actually worth. I've seen a lot of code where there's an example of someone doing something and then doing it again in another file. And then in order to try and make it abstract so that they can reuse one function in one place, they end up defining a function that has 10 plus parameters. At that point, the function no longer makes sense. It's adding more work than it's saving. Another one, I mentioned it earlier, it's more fun to code than it is to change config files. I think that's just universally true for most programmers. Collaboration doesn't always have to be code. Sometimes just the ideas are good. We've had a lot of collaborations on stuff like the Olympics, elections, etc. And it doesn't mean that the systems have to be the same, but the ideas on how we approach the spikes of traffic during the election, those can be shared, and that's very valuable. Finally, if you're making a platform, you shouldn't force someone to use it. You should make them want to use it. And that was something we were massively lacking. The teams that were onboarded to this platform, they were forced to do so, but they didn't want to use it. They absolutely did not want to use it. Whereas if we'd approached the platform from perspectives of those teams and figure out what they need in order to be efficient, in order to save time, so that they can spend more time doing innovative things, I think we would have had a much better chance of success. Yes, so that's me. Thank you. These are QR codes. Follow me on LinkedIn if you want. I have a Tech Enabler Substack where I write about everything that I do at work, more or less. And with that, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
Hello. Yeah. Questions? There's one question in the back. Give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. I have a quick question. So there was a lot of discussion around what went wrong. What went right? What is something you'd keep if you could go back?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of passionate employees who were very dedicated to what they did, but they weren't in the positions where they were able to really act on those, especially if you think about the central teams, which are relatively detached from the end users. So I think we've had a reorg earlier this year, and one of the things that has been very good from that is that we've put those people closer to the end users, which I think is valuable. I think the central team themselves received consistent praise. Like the individuals on those teams were, in every retro that we did, they received a lot of praise on an individual level. I think it's also really good that Schibsted let us do this. Like they let us spend a considerable amount of time and effort and resources in reflecting on what we did wrong. So I think that was really good. And as a result, when we had a reorg earlier this year, this report was heavily used to influence how the reorg took shape. So I think that's a very important part. We actually committed to learning from our mistakes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Got one over here.
I really liked the presentation, and I enjoyed the taco example. And my question is related to whether or not, if you had a VG taco and Bergens Tidende taco, or basically one taco for every team, would that have worked out? Were there any problems with the stakeholders in such a case, or do you have any thoughts reflecting on that?
Yeah, so like if each brand was making their own thing only, then what are the downsides of that? I think one of the biggest downsides is that sometimes we would duplicate things that did make sense to abstract. So I mentioned like, don't always abstract, and sometimes code duplication is good. Sometimes it's also bad. And when you have 7 teams which are building very similar things, you're always going to end up with duplication. And sometimes that duplication ends up taking more time and resources so that you're unable to actually do the important things, innovation or fixing more important bugs or issues or whatever. So I think from a stakeholder perspective, that's one of the downsides. There's also the downsides of costs. So if you have all those individual teams, it's going to be way more expensive than one team making one platform. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? No hands. Thank you very much to show up, even though it was over Zoom link. But give him a good applause.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Substack. See you later.